Before we start, I want to acknowledge that I am joining you today from the land of the Coast Salish peoples, whose ancestors have resided here since time immemorial. There are many indigenous peoples that thrive in this place, alive and strong. I encourage you to recognize the indigenous people, past, present, and future, of the land where you live and work and study. You can find this information at the link that's in the chat at nativeland.ca. The Dean's Forum is our venue for engaging in important conversations about race and public policy, both within our walls at the Evans School and also throughout the community. During this incredibly contentious and momentous election season, voting systems and structures are in the news, on our minds, and impacting millions of people around the US. Voting is simultaneously the most basic and most powerful tool in our democracy, and also at this time, one of the most fraught. So today's session is one of a series of election-related events. This evening, we're going to discuss voting rights and access and suppression. And then the day after the election, Wednesday, November 4th at noon, we will host a discussion and a reflection event moderated by teaching professor Matt Steuerwalt, who will be joined by Chris Vance and Christine Reeves. And then a month after the election, we'll take a retrospective look at what happened in an event we're hosting jointly with UW's Information School. We'll look back at who voted and how, and at what seems to have spurred or thwarted voting. And then during winter and spring quarters, the Dean's Forum on Race and Public Policy will also host events as incoming Dean Jody Sanford joins us. So keep an eye out for those announcements. We have an incredible panel with us today to engage this important conversation about voting rights and access and suppression, and we'll turn to them in a moment. But first, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, Evans School Associate Professor Crystal Hall. Professor Hall teaches and researches as an expert in behavioral psychology, intergroup relations, quantitative methods, and race and equity as applied to public policy and governance challenges. Without further ado, Professor Hall.
Thank you very much. I am absolutely thrilled to have the opportunity to lead this conversation with our panel this afternoon. I'll just very briefly set the stage and explain the format of this event, and then I just want to let our panelists kick us off and get into it because I think it'll be a really exciting hour. As was just mentioned, for many of us, I want to stress that voting is something that we can take for granted. It can be very easy for us to take for granted. And so whether we vote in person or vote by mail, this is a process that often feels very quick and easy and transparent. However, we also know that many voters and potential voters in the United States have not experienced these same privileges. And now, more than ever, I think we can all agree that it's crucial to take a critical lens to understanding who has access to this most important building block of our democracy. So during our discussion today, our panelists will start out by discussing our current systems of voting. They'll help us understand the current legal protections of voters and also understand some of the mechanisms that lead to voter suppression and for whom voter suppression occurs. A huge step towards authentically pursuing anti-racism in our public institutions has to involve acknowledging and addressing the disproportionate impacts of systematic voter suppression on communities of color. Then we'll shift to spend some time focusing on potential strategies for mitigating some of these barriers in the service of protecting voter rights in our democracy more broadly. So I'm really excited to lead this conversation. The format will be pretty straightforward. I'll introduce our panelists, and I'm going to invite each of them to speak for about 5 minutes to give us more introduction to them and the lens that they've taken on these important questions. Then we'll shift to some Q&A, and we will wrap up and close out the event at 6 p.m. Many of you submitted questions for our panelists in advance at the time that you registered. If you have a question throughout the session, you can submit it via the Q&A button down below, and we'll answer if time allows. We have a lot of questions already, and thank you to everyone who submitted questions in advance. And I also want to stress that we've got a great panel, and we've all committed to modeling the civility that this topic deserves. This is a time when many of us are angry and frustrated, and it's so important that we find spaces to talk about these things in a constructive manner. And one other important note before I introduce our panelists, we're really sorry to share that Washington State Secretary of State, Kim Wyman, was going to be a part of the panel, but had a conflict arise and isn't able to be here today. I'm nonetheless still incredibly thrilled to introduce our panelists, and I'll do that now before I let them take the stage. First, I'd like to introduce Sean Morales-Doyle. Sean is the Deputy Director of the Voting Rights and Elections Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. He advocates for pro-voter reforms like automatic voter registration and voting rights restoration while fighting back against voter suppression efforts in the courts. Prior to joining the Brennan Center, his practice was primarily labor, employment, civil rights, and constitutional litigation. Next, we have Washington State Party Chair Tina Pavlovsky. Under her leadership, the Washington Democrats have implemented a year-round organizing program that supports diverse local candidates for office through the Rise and Run program. And in 2020, the Washington State Democratic Coordinated Campaign has led the country in virtual organizing to get out the vote during this pandemic, making more than 1.5 million phone calls to educate and assist Washingtonians in making a plan to vote. And our third panelist is Jacob Grumbach. Jake is an assistant professor of political science here at the University of Washington and also a faculty associate with the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies. His research focuses broadly on the political economy of the United States with an emphasis on public policy, racial and economic inequality, American federalism, and statistical methods. Previously, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the Study of Democratic Politics at Princeton University. So, without any more ado, I'm going to let our panelists jump in. I'll start with Sean and give you 5 minutes to tell us about your perspective on these issues.
Great, thanks so much. Thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be on this panel with so many impressive people, and I'm just always excited to see lots of people turning out to hear more about the topic that I spend so much of my life working on. So thank you. As Crystal mentioned, I'm at the Brennan Center for Justice. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank and policy institute in New York, and DC actually. We're affiliated with NYU School of Law, and our goal is essentially to improve and defend our systems of democracy and justice. I focus specifically on voting rights and elections, but we work on a number of other topics as well. And I guess what we work on, as Crystal mentioned, is both pushing for good policy and fighting back against bad policy in this area. I think in many ways, our nation's history has really been one of struggling toward, of a constant struggle toward a truly inclusive democracy, one that actually gives everyone the right to vote. And a constant push back against that struggle and constant attempts to deprive folks of the right to vote. And the last decade or so has been, more of that same history. I think we've seen a trend starting about a decade ago of a sort of new proliferation of laws aimed at suppressing votes. Those laws saw an uptick and were sort of unleashed in part as a result of the Supreme Court's decision in 2013 to essentially gut a major provision in the Voting Rights Act, the pre-clearance provision, which we can talk about more, but essentially freed a number of jurisdictions around the country to start passing laws that previously would have been subject to review by the federal government before going into effect. And the trend had already begun before that, but that really sort of accelerated things. And we've seen a trend in the last decade or so of states passing laws like restrictive voter ID laws, documentary proof of citizenship laws, increasing the way that they aggressively purge voters off the rolls, any number of different things that have had a serious impact on the right to vote. Thankfully, we've also seen a countervailing trend, and that, as I think, ramped up more recently, of a lot of states passing expansive policies to give more people the right to vote, make voting access easier. And I think that's come along with a trend towards voters caring a lot more about this issue. I think this is democracy reform, making sure that we have an inclusive democracy and expansive democracy has really become top on the list of issues for a lot of voters in a way that I don't think it used to be. I think that, you know, your average citizen is more well versed in the kinds of things that I work on every day than they were a few years ago. And that's really encouraging. And I think it's reflected in the fact that Congress has actually prioritized these things, at least in the House. The first bill that Congress moved last year, H.R. 1, when this Congress took went into session, was the For the People Act, and it was a wide range of democracy reform. And I think so. You know, our representatives in D.C. and in many states are hearing from voters that this is a thing that they care about. Just to quickly turn to the specifics of what I mean in these trends, you know, on the bad side of things, we've seen, as I mentioned, voter ID laws and other things. We've also seen, you know, and to give an example of the kind of work we do, what we're usually doing with regard to these bad policies is we're going to court and we're suing to try to stop them. This year, more of my time has been spent probably than anything else litigating a case in Florida where the state of Florida essentially is requiring people with felony convictions in their past to pay money to pay off all of their fines and fees before they're able to vote. And we sued Florida to try to prevent that from happening, and we won in trial court back in May. Unfortunately, we recently suffered a setback and lost in the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. And so that law is going to be on the books for this election in November. On the other side of things, the sort of good trend, and I should also mention, and I can talk about this more, but we've also done a lot of litigation and are involved in litigation now with respect to many changes in the policies this year. Because of voting during a pandemic, there's been a lot of changes in policies in both directions, and we've been staying abreast of that. The last thing I'll mention is the positive work we do to try to get good, expansive, voter-friendly policies on the books in state governments across the country and hopefully in DC as well. Those include things like automatic voter registration and a lot of other policies that, since we're virtually in Washington today, at least I am, that Washington already has for the most part. Washington's actually been at the head of that trend of really promoting an expansive democracy that includes everyone. But I will say that the state of Washington is behind on one of the policies that I spent a lot of my time pushing for, and that is restoring voting rights to people with convictions in their past. Washington is sort of in the middle of the pack on that issue and well behind about a third of the country. And there have been attempts in successive legislatures to fix that, and it hasn't been able to get across the finish line. So we're really hoping maybe that that's in the near future for Washington. I might have gone a little over my 5 minutes. Sorry to everyone else.
That's okay. Thank you. A couple of the points that you raised, we will certainly come back to. So thank you. That was great. We'll move to Tina next, please.
Thank you so much, Crystal. And I'm so excited to be here. Full disclosure, I'm sort of an Evans School dropout. I never finished my MPA, so I feel like a poser being here today on this panel a little bit, and do want to make sure that everyone knows what a treasure the Evans School is for these kinds of discussions and for public policy just throughout the Pacific Northwest. So thank you for being here today. You know, as chair of the Washington State Democrats, I bring the sort of the practitioner view, right? Right now it's 21 days to go before the election. My goal is to try to figure out how to make sure every last person in the state of Washington votes. As the Democratic Party chair, I want more of them to vote Democratic, but more than anything else, I want them to vote. And so throughout this entire voting network and thinking of this perspective, there are these practitioners running these state parties, thinking about it at the national level, about how do we make sure that everyone has access and opportunity to vote. For me, this became an issue when I made a career change and became one of the founders of the Alliance for Gun Responsibility way back when, after the Sandy Hook shooting. What was really clear after that experience in running a statewide initiative campaign was that as Washington State, yeah, we had mail-in ballots, but there were so many ways that we were putting barriers in place that kept people from being able to vote. That's ultimately why I ended up running against Kim Wyman, who I'm so sorry, Kim Wyman, our Secretary of State, is not here today to talk about the issues, but we ran against each other in 2016. And then after that, I became the state party chair, because to me, there were several issues that came up in that campaign, as well as others that we have been able to do some work on. That was pre-registration of folks who were 16 and 17, so they would be able to vote, automatic voter registration, same-day registration, postage paid ballots, which eliminated a poll tax. And, you know, as the mom of a couple of 20-somethings, I don't think they could find a stamp if you even described what the heck a stamp was, really, to be able to put on the ballot to get their vote in. But really, these efforts and the efforts that I end up talking about with other state party chairs have been a part of this arc to figure out how to make sure that the work that we're doing gets to every single voter, especially overcoming both economic challenges as well as systemic racism within our voting systems. Look, you go back to our Constitution, and most of us who are on the panel here, we probably wouldn't be able to vote, right? Under that initial system. If you think about who's gotten the right to vote and when they've gotten the right to vote, you know, for many folks, it was the 60s and the 70s when you're thinking about certain populations, particularly our Native American populations, who've gotten those rights and had those rights to be able to vote. So we think about this all the time. And for the last 2 years or so, there's been a group of us, myself in Washington, as well as folks in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Michigan, who have been thinking about how do we break down some of these barriers, and barriers that include everything from voter fatigue, which happens when you have, you know, 4 or 5 different elections in a particular cycle for folks, and they're not sure, is it a school bond election? Is it a local election? Is it a national election? What's happening? Not knowing how to vote, which seems for many folks who have used vote by mail, they might think that, what are you talking about? How could that possibly be an issue? But not knowing how to vote. If you're a new voter, if you're a voter for whom English is a second language, if you're a voter who's never voted by mail before, the steps to be able to vote and feeling confident in your vote, everything from making sure you're putting that ballot into the security envelope, to signing that ballot, to knowing that you don't have to vote for every single office on the election for your ballot to count. I have to tell you, we have so many conversations with people who simply don't vote because they are afraid of doing it wrong and don't want to do it wrong. Access issues, even when you think about access issues to drop boxes and safe ways to be able to get your ballot in. You know, King County is probably the gold standard here in Washington state in terms of access. There's 73 different drop boxes that are open all the time once the voting period starts. There are 7 different voting centers. But think about the area of King County. We're about 2,300 square miles. Go to Yakima County, where 32% of the voters are Latinx voters. Yakima County has an area of 4,300 square miles. They have 7 compared to 73, 7 drop boxes that are open for the entire voting period, and they are scattered, and it is tough to get to them. And post office, particularly in a pandemic year, not the most reliable. We've been doing different checks around first class mail around the state since summer to try to ascertain what this issue would look like. And probably the most difficult issues for us have been in central and eastern Washington. I'll give you an example of that, where a first class letter mailed from Tri-Cities to Walla Walla, which is about an hour's drive if you're in a car, took 15 days to arrive from Tri-Cities to Walla Walla, where it got routed from Tri-Cities to Spokane to Yakima, back to Tri-Cities, and then back to Walla Walla. And that makes you afraid about your ballot and working through that. There are also issues related to what happens and what are the statistics around ballot curing or being able to fix a mistake on your ballot. And disproportionately, Native American communities, Latinx communities have ballots that require curing and do not necessarily have a great way of being notified that their ballot needs to be cured from the various county auditors. So as a practitioner, for me, it's all about how do you find the different places in the system that you can fix these things that are impacting certain groups of voters. And I'll end with this. Here in Washington state, the one thing that we don't have as a law is an opportunity, again, for people who are dealing with a felony or some other sort of conviction to make sure that they have their right to vote restored. That's on the docket, I think, for us in the next legislative session. But also think about the fact that there's about 5.4 million people in Washington state who are eligible to be registered to vote, and only about 4.6 million who are registered to vote. Why does that gap exist? And who are the folks for whom that gap exists? They tend to be people of color, young people, folks who are lower to middle class in terms of income, or folks who are in poverty, who are just not getting the access to express their voice. And as John Lewis says in HR 1, the bill that had been mentioned previously by Seth, or by Sean rather, HR 1 is now the John Lewis Act, and your vote is your voice. So how are we giving voice to everyone in the state of Washington, in fact, in the entire country, in fact, in 57 states and territories, because let's not forget those and voters abroad, to make sure they can express their voice? We still haven't reached the promise of what I think America should be when it comes to the vote.
Thank you, Tina. I'm excited to come back to some of those points as well. In particular, really getting into some of the questions about what do we do about this? And so we'll come back to that in a little bit. I want to move to Jake now and give you an opportunity to share a little bit about your work.
Thanks, Crystal, and great to follow Sean and Tina here. So in both Sean and Tina's comments here, I think we got great sort of on the ground, both legal battle and practitioner administrator based sort of evidence for how voting works at the state and county levels. And I want to just say more broadly how unique it is. The American system of decentralized federalism in the US Constitution going back to the 1780s puts election administration and all sort of voting-based election policy at the state level. So there's no one particular American system of voting. There are really 50 election systems in the US, and at the county level, there's variation within states across counties. There could be up to 1,650 total sort of voting systems in the US. This makes coordination tremendously difficult. So during a pandemic, switching to safer vote by mail in places that don't have an established vote by mail system becomes extremely difficult. It means many places don't invest comparatively very much in the mechanisms of democracy in voting and election administration. The US, compared to other wealthy democracies, spends a low amount of its GDP on sort of the democratic mechanisms of election administration. And the fact that states have been election administrators and determined who was allowed to vote and who hasn't been allowed to vote, that throughout American history has been the battleground for whether Black Americans, women, Native Americans, young people, who is eligible to vote, and how costly and difficult it is for them to exercise their vote on the ballot, either by mail or in person. So just to give you a sense of some of my research on this, so recently we've seen, as Sean sort of suggested, we've seen a growing polarization across states where there's greater variation in how easy it is to access the ballot depending on your state. So some states are trending more in terms of more open access to the ballot. So Washington State over the past decade really has been a major leader, along with states like Colorado, in pursuing same-day voter registration, which my research shows tremendously important for young people who move for change jobs, move out of their parents' house, move to college, things like that, and have to re-register and may not register. In different states, you may have to register 45 or 60 days before the election. Issues of felon disenfranchisement that we've talked about. So in Florida, the number of Floridians disenfranchised is up to 10% of the eligible Florida population that would be otherwise eligible to vote is not, due to the felony disenfranchisement policy, and now this sort of like halfway fines and fees based policy. And this is up to 22% of Black adults in Florida. This is tremendously, a tremendous producer of racial inequality in voting. And all of these policies that make it more or less costly to vote interact with the history of marginalization and exclusion from the democratic process that groups, especially Black Americans, and Native Americans, but also just including young people and people who don't own homes and this sort of thing, this is all absolutely crucial. So this is one place, the two places in American federalism that make the battleground of democratic performance at the state level, where your voice really matters in influencing what your state does, are issues of election administration and electoral policy and access to the ballot. So in a state like Texas now, the governor has just moved to say each county can only have one vote by mail drop-off location, right? Contrast this to, for example, in Seattle, where there are a large number of voter drop-off locations, and you can see students dunk in their ballots enthusiastically and things like that. In Texas, what they're doing is a county like Harris County, millions of people in the Houston metropolitan area have one drop box, and small exurban counties that are demographically much older and whiter have the same amount of drop boxes, much more per capita. These are really intentional policies to affect the cost of voting for different demographic groups. This is absolutely crucial at the state level. The other thing that affects democracy is sort of how authoritarian your policing and criminal justice system is. And constitutionally, that's also at the state level. So in election policy and sort of criminal justice and sort of authoritarian policing issues, those are concentrated at the state level. And that's where issues of, social movements and activism can really matter, even in a place like Washington State that tends to vote one particular way in presidential elections. You may not feel like your vote matters that much in a presidential election in Washington State, but your voice really does matter in affecting state outcomes on issues of democracy itself.
Thank you very much, Jake. And I think highlighting the importance of thinking about the role of our participation in state and local elections is so important, because often in these presidential election cycles, we get very focused on particular parts of the country and particular states, and that's another point we can come back to. Before we move on to just kind of digging a little bit deeper into this complex web of issues, I wanted to give each of you an opportunity, and we'll go in reverse order, but we'll be pretty brief this time. Is there anything in your work that you've encountered or issues about, or aspects of these issues that are really commonly misunderstood by the general public that you'd like to raise to us now? I think some of us are somewhat familiar, but maybe not familiar with the extent of the issues, but are there aspects that are just really misunderstood? I'll put you back on the spot first, Jake.
Sure. So I would say, this phenomenon, just to be a broken record, the concentration of the importance of the mechanisms of democracy being at the state level is really underemphasized. So right now, there are legal battles about counting mail ballots and how strict the signature matching requirements with voter registration signatures should be. These are battles right now in state courts that will go up to federal courts as well. There's a plethora of battles going on. This actually, overall, I think, makes it harder to expand democracy in the US more broadly. The fact that there's no national, so the Federal Election Commission actually regulates campaign finance in the US. There's no sort of national, especially after the gutting of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, there's no national administration out there really sort of policing election administration and ensuring equitable and broad access to the ballot. This really occurs state by state, and it means electoral geography, where you live, matters tremendously. We know about things like malapportionment in the Senate, where a voter in Wyoming has about a 70 times larger voice than a voter in California in the Senate. But this electoral geography and the fact that the mechanisms of democracy are at the state level has been a long-standing barrier to expanding democracy in the US. When we think back to really laws legalizing slavery being state-level laws that were eventually dismantled by the national government, and then later Jim Crow laws, the exact same story there. So we think often, especially in a time like this, we think, returning power to the state and local level, this is kind of a panacea. This will solve all our problems and allow us to, in a local way, customize our laws to our local communities. but actually it's been a major obstacle to a healthy democracy in the US for hundreds of years.
Thank you. And I think that's a good transition back to you, Tina. Anything you want to highlight that you think is really commonly misunderstood about these issues?
Sure, and I'll even take it one level lower than what Jake has mentioned at the state level, and to talk about local election officials, or in Washington state, the 39 different election directors or county auditors that manage the process at the local level within your county. They have tremendous leeway in terms of the decisions they have regarding if there are drop boxes, how many drop boxes there are, if there are accessible voting centers, if they are somebody who is viewing their role narrowly as just counting the votes. And that's it. That's what my job is. Make sure the ballots get sent out and counting the votes, all the way to, is my job to make sure that I'm reaching out to diverse communities within my area, in this case in my county, to make certain that I've got ballots in language for that area, to make certain voter education is happening, to make certain I'm doing voter outreach and aggressive voter registration efforts. So I think that that's an area where it varies throughout the entire state of Washington. And in fact, it varies in every state as well at that local level in terms of who you have in those positions. It is an elected position for the most part in all of these areas. And it's one of those local election positions that people don't think about. They hear the word auditor or they hear election director and they tune out. And it is one of the most important positions when you're thinking about that at a county level, for people to have access and their say in those county issues, those statewide issues, and in federal politics as well.
I think both Jake and Tina made some really good points. And I think so much of the way elections work and how voting works and how people are allowed to vote, or where they vote, or who counts the votes and when, and which officials are in charge of it and everything. I think there's so many of those things that are completely unknown to the vast majority of American voters, even people who are actively involved. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. But certainly one of them is this variation that everyone's talking about. It's hard to know how elections work when they work differently everywhere. And it is part of, just to focus in on a specific issue, it ends up being, that alone can have a disenfranchising effect on people. And an example of that is in the context of rights restoration, right? We have differing policies across the country in terms of whether you're eligible to vote when you're in prison or out of prison, on probation, on parole, have you paid your legal financial obligations, who can restore your voting rights to you? Is it the governor? Is it a clemency board? Every state, you've got this range, and even within states, it can be confusing, right? California, right next door to Washington, you can vote when you're on some forms of community supervision, but you can't vote when you're on parole. In Washington, you can vote when you finish probation and parole, but what the law says, you actually only get your vote restored provisionally, and if you don't pay your legal financial obligations off fast enough, that it can be revoked from you. In practice, it seems like that's never actually happened to anybody in Washington, but it's there on the books. And when you have those kinds of confusing and varying rules across the country, it actually disenfranchises people. Because if I'm a person with a conviction in my past, and I don't know whether I'm eligible to vote, because I've heard something about how if you're still on paper, then you're not eligible. I've heard this story about Florida where you have to pay everything off or whatever. I'm not going to go vote if I think I'm risking being accused of committing another felony by voting. And there have been stories, and people see these stories in the news, of people being sent to prison for years for voting because they thought they were eligible, but they weren't because they're on parole and they didn't understand that. And it's not just in the area of rights restoration. I think this confusion over how things work and how much they vary actually can frequently have a disenfranchising effect. People in Washington may be very used to voting by mail. People in New York are not. And when all of a sudden everyone's voting by mail, you see a lot of mistakes being made because people don't know how it works. So I think, to sort of reiterate the points that have been made, this variation, in some ways, it does allow for some really productive, good policy in places where things work well, like in Washington. And that's great, and it's good to see that. And this is a laboratories of democracy and all that. But just the variation in and of itself can actually have a disenfranchising effect on people.
Mind if I jump in with a quick point? This is so excellent. So not only, I think between Tina and Sean, they're bringing out, not only is it variation in de jure law on the books, for example, can an ex-felon vote legally, but also implementation. So we see now in some early voting, there's been evidence this election cycle of first day early voting taking 11 hours in line for some individuals. And statistically, we know from political science quantitative research that on average, Black and Latino people face longer lines on average. And that's about things like who is elected local election administrator, as Tina was mentioning. And then the other sort of pathology of this is that the lowest level offices that people don't have much information about, those elections are dominated by older, wealthier, whiter voters who tend to own homes and things like that. And they run the sort of local city council meetings in many small towns and these sorts of things where it takes tremendous amounts of time, money, information, and other efforts that working people, people who have kids, young people, people moving are not able to do at these lower levels. This is a huge problem in inequality, and this is borne out in all sorts of local policy areas like policing and housing and so forth.
And very quickly to add on to that with what Jake said, if you're in King County, you're going to get a voter pamphlet. In many counties in the state of Washington, you're not even going to get a voter pamphlet. So your access to information to try to understand who those individuals are, and even if you read the voter pamphlet, it's still pretty slim. It has been diminished considerably in these local areas. So it's something that makes it tougher in these local races. And it's something that, again, also impacts who's in those seats making decisions about how those local races are featured.
Thank you, everyone. I want to add one more layer before we start to talk about what some of the potential solutions are to some of these issues. We are still in the middle of a pandemic, which I know that I don't need to remind anyone. And you know, the safety and security and access for folks in the middle of this pandemic is very much at the front of people's minds. So I'll start with Tina this time. If you could just tell us a little bit about, you know, how is Washington State, you know, we're also in a unique situation because we're voting by mail, but what are some of the considerations that are being made?
So for all of my campaign experience, I'd have to say this has been the craziest electoral year ever in terms of trying to do a get out the vote program for voters, because so much of it has been predicated upon gathering and door knocking, the ability to have events, the ability to gather people together. And in many communities, gathering together to vote, particularly Native American communities and other diverse communities, has been something that has historically worked and upped the level of voting. Many of our tribes, for example, will have a big dinner like 10 days or so before ballots are due. Everybody brings their ballots, they eat together, they fill out their ballots, they put it in the mailbox, and off it goes with that. So I think the pandemic itself has had that tremendous effect. It's also had another effect, I think, too, where it has impacted polarization. There are no conversations that are more serendipitous, right? When you're communicating with someone, it tends to be much more deliberate. We're talking more at Zoom meetings. You have to opt in to be there. You're not happening upon an event. You're not going and potentially talking to a friend at the coffee shop. And so that level of polarization where folks have made up their mind months and months before, I think has had a disparate impact on this particular election cycle. I would venture to say there's not one undecided voter, I mean real undecided voter in the entire country. There's only people who have not decided whether or not they're going to cast their ballot. And that changes the entire dynamic about how you turn out people to be able to vote.
Thank you. Sean, how about a national perspective on the same question? How do we look at these issues in the face of also considering the pandemic?
Yeah, well, the way democracy and elections work in this country has changed quite a bit just in the last 6, 7, 8 months. And that's not as much the case in Washington, where, you know, we actually have a chart on the Brennan Center's website called Preparing Your State for Elections in a Pandemic, and we have all 50 states in DC and where they stand on a variety of policies that we sort of think are crucial for having healthy, open, fair, free elections during a pandemic. And Washington has a blue check mark on every single policy that we've got on there. But in the rest of the country, you know, things that are maybe taken for granted in a place like Washington haven't been on the books, right? Here in New York, where I live, you had to have a specific excuse in order to cast a ballot by mail up until this year. And the governor and the legislature allowed for the coronavirus pandemic to be a reason for anybody this year, but that's brand new here. Early voting is also brand new here as of a year before that, but didn't exist. Early in-person voting does not exist everywhere. Drop boxes and things like that. And early voting is crucial in terms of, you know, where you do have in-person voting, in terms of flattening the voting curve, making sure you don't have huge crowds showing up. 11-hour wait times are always terrible. Lines of that length during a pandemic are particularly frightening and do make people have to worry about their own health and safety when they're going to vote, which is terrible. Things like, you know, when do you have to return your ballot by, and when is it going to be counted in a mail balloting system, whether or not there's postage paid, all those kinds of things that have been worked out in a state that has had mail voting for a long time are being worked out on the fly in a lot of other states right now, and changes are being made and rules are being changed. Litigation is going on, and that can lead to changes in rules. For instance, as Jake mentioned, in Texas, the governor allowed for, sort of expanded the way that mail voting would work in Texas this year, although it's still not the case that everybody can cast a mail ballot in Texas. But then after he did that, a number of counties started providing for drop boxes in a bunch of different locations. And the governor responded by issuing a proclamation that said, no, you can only have one drop box per county. And so now you've got, as you mentioned, a county of over 4 million people, the third largest county in the country, with one drop box. Some of my colleagues were in court all day today on a temporary restraining order hearing in state court. There was just a federal court decision late last night saying that it was okay for the governor to do that, or essentially allowing that to proceed. And now today there was an all-day temporary restraining order hearing in state court, hoping that a state court might find differently. That kind of litigation and frankly sometimes confusing decisions coming from multiple courts is happening in states across the country on a lot of different policies. So I will, and then there's the fact that, like, all of this stuff, you know, we put out guidelines on how to hold safe, healthy in-person voting during a pandemic that we worked on with the Infectious Diseases Society of America. That's a thing you can do, but that and running a mail system and all these other things costs money, and elections officials need more money in order to do what they're doing. So we've been pushing Congress to include that in the stimulus, and they did a little bit early on, but it just wasn't as much as it should have been. So I will commend our nation's elections officials, state and local, across the country, for doing a whole lot of really important work in a short time frame, responding to changing conditions, and with limited resources. I think we really have seen a shift in the way elections work in a way that is going to allow everybody to cast a ballot, or you know, far more people than we might have expected 6 months ago to cast a ballot during a pandemic in a way that is healthy and safe. There's still work to be done, and there certainly have been victories and losses along the way. But it's been a pretty crazy year for this, among every other reason that you can think of.
Thank you, Sean. So, Jake, I'm going to come back to you in a moment, but I'm going to shift us a little bit because we don't have a ton of time left, and I really want to spend the rest of the time thinking about what do we do? How do we find solutions to this? So, Jake, in some of your work, you've really done a nice job of highlighting the need for an intersectional approach to just understanding some of these issues from a research perspective. And a lot of that's with respect to race and gender specifically. How can that type of approach help us refine our understanding of voter suppression in particular, and how we find ways to mitigate it and find solutions for it?
That's a great point. So I think, thinking intersectional is crucial in this political moment, and thinking about identity in general, not in a superficial way, but thinking it just is the partisan sort of coalitions now are heavily racialized in that where the parties are now sorted based on their electoral bases. One is nearly all white. One contains almost every, like the vast majority of Americans of color, and extreme majorities of Black Americans. This creates a really difficult and sort of precarious moment for democracy, where it gives one party some incentive to target specific demographic groups, particularly racially, because they know that they're unlikely to vote for them. This creates new incentives to restrict democracy, and is part of the sort of risk of democratic backsliding that many scholars and thinkers and pundits are talking about right now. This is crucial. But my work in intersectionality, a lot of it focuses on money in politics, a different form of participation, campaign contributions, different form of participation in voting. And I will just say, it's absolutely crucial. So voting in general elections, obviously absolutely crucial. Due to the US institutional structure of districts, you're gonna have two major parties for the most part. And that's critical in general elections, but voting in primaries and other forms of participation, including money in politics and social movement activity, are absolutely crucial for shaping what American politics and government and what the parties do in office. And it shifts party agendas across time. It has done historically. And moving, for example, the Democratic Party to be a more racially diverse party through the 20th century. That was a lot of social movement activity, shifting the party's positions on gender rights, LGBT rights, economic rights, housing rights. So many things have been the force of social movements pressuring incumbents to blow with the political wind. So I would, and the pandemic, that we've seen potentially the largest protest movement in American history during a pandemic year. And that's, it's both inspiring and yet concerning due to the pandemic, and how to facilitate those sorts of activities to shape, to, in this case, push both parties to address sort of racial authoritarianism in policing in this case, which actually some other research in state policy shows that over the past generation, Democratic and Republican states have done similar criminal justice, tough on crime policies and similar policing, including in states like California. And this social movement has been extremely consequential. So I'll just say that's another intersectional way of thinking about people engage, sort of marginalized groups that don't have a lot of, monetary resources, making their voice heard in politics when voting in general elections is not enough to shift what a party does.
Thank you. And then going back to Tina, curious what you think about the question of, there were multiple questions just about trust in general. How do we start building back trust in these systems? Because I think there is this common perception that, these are institutions that shouldn't be trusted. How do we start to build that back?
Well, I think that you've had sort of 5 decades of, one party sort of talking about government as an institution that's not trustworthy in itself, and that we need to, tear that government apart, and, you know best, and you should pick, and it's all about you, as opposed to us. But I do think some of it is shifting from this model where there is just obscene amounts of money being spent in politics to an organizing-based model. I think that's something that we've tried to implement over the course of the last 4 years, and it's nowhere near exactly where we want it to be. But within Washington State, with our party moving to organizing, not just 6 months before an election and trying to get someone to vote for you, but 365 days a year, 24/7, being in community and getting candidates that represent communities and are reflective of those communities into office at every possible level. In 2018, in the elections for the state legislature, we were able to elect the most diverse state legislature in the history of Washington State. And in 2020, we're going to best that number. I firmly believe it. So to me, the way that you build trust back is getting away from the money, getting away from the TV and the big bucks consultants and all of those things, and getting back to an organizing model that's community-based, where you understand what's happening in somebody's life, you understand what's happening in somebody's neighborhood, and you're serving those people appropriately and able to show them what's happening. We have some great examples, I think, of elected officials in Washington State who've really built their, their efforts around organizing nationally, AOC is one who comes to mind, certainly, in a variety of folks. But even here, kind of where some of us are sitting in Seattle, Pramila Jayapal is a great example of that in doing that piece of work. So I think we're on the cusp of a transition of these movements and these organizing models transcending, hopefully, the money in politics and moving us to a different place. And I believe that's what's going to end up building trust in the end.
Thank you. And Sean, coming back to another point, and actually this ties to a point that Tina made earlier about the reality that in this election cycle that we're in the middle of right now, it seems very unlikely that there are true undecided voters, right? It's really, I think, a question about, some of us, do have the right to vote, and it's very easy. And that also makes it easy for us to also just not exercise that right to vote. And so with that in mind, how do you think about engaging with people who do feel like they don't want to engage with this system? And how can the engagement of those folks help support and create more access for those that don't have it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I do want to, it's been bugging me since a while ago, and I just feel like I need to say it so I don't look like the person from out east that doesn't know my Western geography. I do know that California is not actually directly next door to Washington, so I misspoke when I said that earlier. I think that I think a lot of there's actually been a lot of progress on one place where I think this is important with the protest movement that we've been seeing with the uprisings and everything else, is that there's been a renewed focus on local offices that have real, as Jake was mentioning, another place where we have local control over a lot of things is policing. And since that's been the focus of the policing and the criminal justice system have been the focus of so much of this protest movement, I think it's made people start paying more attention to local races for sheriffs and district attorneys and those kinds of positions that have a very direct impact on a lot of people's lives, but often are not the subject of much political discussion for folks. And I think that's one way that you get people to start being engaged and paying attention, is bringing attention to how elections impact their lives in very real ways and the lives of their neighbors. And sometimes that means focusing on the local rather than on the national. I think this is an election on the national level that a lot of people feel like is going to have a real impact on their lives. And so that is getting a lot more people engaged, but it sort of proves the same point, which is people have to see how these things relate to them in a way that's more real and tangible. I also think that the issue of democracy reform has been an issue like that. I think people are getting engaged on the question of how our democracy works and whether it is fair. And I think that that's sort of intertwined with this notion of trust and engagement, is that people, part of what this rhetoric of distrust is, we hear constantly this false rhetoric about our election system being rife with fraud or untrustworthy or rigged or everything else. It sends a message to people that this is not a worthy system of participating in. It's not one that we can trust. It's not one we can have faith in. And when people believe that, then they're not going to participate in it. On the contrary, if people feel like it is an inclusive and real democratic system, I think they're more likely to engage. So when people see a way to engage with the notion of including their neighbors, and when they hear their politicians talking to them about how they want more people to come out and vote and they want it to be an inclusive process, instead of coming up with excuses to tell them to stay home, that gets people more engaged and involved. I think people have really been inspired by seeing, things like the movement for Amendment 4 in Florida, this ballot initiative to restore voting rights to people with felony convictions in their past, and there's one on the ballot in California in November to restore voting rights to people upon release from prison. These are sort of, in some sense, this is direct democracy, right? This is like voters putting the thing on the ballot and then voting for it. And these are movements led by people who are disenfranchised themselves. People who cannot vote and can't participate in this way in democracy are being more democratic than any of us. And they're showing us what it really looks like to be democratic. The same with folks marching in the streets. We're seeing people engage in democratic action because they feel that their voices aren't being heard. In some cases, they literally do not have a formal voice in our electoral system. and they're finding other ways to be heard. I think that that's really inspiring to people, and it's making people see that there are ways that, you know, that those of us for whom it is easy and those of us for whom voting has always been an option do take it for granted, and we really should be inspired to engage when we see other folks engaging in that kind of amazing democratic behavior.
Thank you very much. So we're just about at the end of our time. So I want to offer each one of the panelists an opportunity just to give us a very, very quick final word. And if you will, I would love for you to tell us what's something that we each can do, everyone watching today, other than vote. So don't just say we should all vote, because everyone on this call is going to vote. What can we do in the service of preserving the ability for everyone to engage? So I'm going to go back to Jake, and you've all got like 15 seconds.
In addition to the social movement activity Sean just mentioned, I think another thing is joining local federated organizations. You can start your own. There was the Indivisible movement as an example, other local groups based in certain policy areas, issues, the environment, whatnot. But really the decline of things like the labor movement and labor organizations has been extremely key, and the decline of sort of local community organizations has been a true obstacle to democracy. So joining organizations, talking about politics with those people in those formal or informal organizations, like your local union at your workplace.
Thank you, Jake. Sean, 15 seconds.
Call your senator and your representative and tell them to pass rights restoration for people coming out of prison in Washington. They could do that, you know, right at the beginning of the session this year, but they need to hear, apart from voting, which sometimes sounds corny, but obviously important. I can tell you, I talk to legislators all the time. I'm sure Tina can tell you this too. They really do care more about what their voters say to them than they care about what someone like me has to say to them. So call them if you want them to do this and make it a priority.
Thank you. And Tina, last words?
We have a whole voter protection team that's nonpartisan. We have 26 attorneys who are part of that voter protection team. I want to give you the phone number for Washington State. Use that number with any of your friends, family, yourself, if you have an issue with your ballot, but make sure that you know it to help other folks in their voting, because people will have issues in this election. It's an easy number. It's 206-309-VOTE. And it's 206-309-VOTE. Use it for any single question. It is staffed all the time. And for the next 21 days, we will be answering and helping and moving you through that whole process. We don't care who you're going to vote for as long as you vote. Well, I kind of do care, but we don't care. We just want to make sure that everyone's expressing themselves via their vote. That's their voice.
Well, thank you, Jake, Tina, Sean. This was a fantastic conversation. We barely scratched the surface of the questions that were submitted and the questions that were asked, but thank you for taking the time with us today. And thank you to everyone for joining us. And go vote, please. Take care.
Nice to virtually meet you all. See you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Really interesting. Oh, we got Rebecca back.